Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hello, guys. Okay. I'm ready. Next episode. If you have not seen the prior episode, then go watch it now or copy someone's notes. Let's do it.
The Swedish victory at Fraustadt practically ended the Western theatre of the Great Northern War and left Charles XII free to return to the long-neglected Eastern Front. Peter,
Phones away. Pay attention. Pop quiz at the end.
yet to earn his great moniker, came out wiser from his defeat at Narva. Emboldened by the gains which Russia had made in the last few years and his new and reformed army, he awaited the arrival of his greatest rival. The clash of these era-defining individuals in the next few years would be the tipping point of the war.
Gustavus Adolphus, 30 Years' War. Charles XII, Great Northern War.
Changing European politics for the coming centuries. We're not saying that Peter having better hair than Charles played a role in this war, but it couldn't have hurt, right? Here's the truth that can hurt. 2 out of 3 guys will experience some kind of hair loss or male pattern baldness by the time they're 35.
Make sure if you do this, guys, use the /kings, keeps.com/kings. It makes them know that they're being sent from kings and generals, and then they will get more money.
And here is another truth that can help you. The sponsor of this video, Keeps, is here to prevent hair loss. It happened to the main historian of this channel, and although it's too late for him, it's not too late for you. He didn't act on time, but that shouldn't be the case for you, as Keeps allows you to get treated from home. As thanks to Keeps, you can avoid an awkward visit to the doctor, and your hair loss medication can be delivered to your home. Keeps offers generic versions.
They always say that, from like erectile dysfunction to hair loss. It's like to keep that awkward conversation with your doctor. It's like it's your doctor. Like when I go to the doctor, I am an open book. I tell him what the deal is, and it's his job. He's not going to tell anyone.
Of 2 FDA-approved hair loss products. You'll be surprised by the price. Remember, prevention is the key in these matters. Keeps treatments typically take between 4 to 6 months
Avoid that
to see
awkward
results,
conversation.
so it's important to act fast. The sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors. Hundreds of thousands of men trust Keeps for their hair loss prevention medication. If you're ready to act and prevent hair loss, go to keeps.com/kings or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. In the aftermath of defeating Polish-Saxon forces and signing the Treaty of Altenstadt in October, Charles did not leave Saxony immediately, instead choosing to settle down for winter. This was primarily done so the Swedish army could rest, following 6 years of nearly constant campaigning. It also served the purpose of pressuring the Saxons into gathering the war indemnities as quickly as possible. The treaty itself was not immediately signed by Augustus, as he was still in Poland with
Augustus was still in Poland after the Treaty of Altenstadt, and even participated in a battle against Swedes, the Battle of Kalis. At last, he was forced to return to Saxony when Charles revealed the treaty publicly.
Peter. The Tsar terrified Augustus, so much so that the Elector of Saxony did not dare tell him of his unconditional surrender. It was only in the dead of winter, when Russian forces were retreating east, that Augustus could leave for Saxony. Peter was enraged after learning of the Saxon capitulation, because he knew that his position in Poland was hanging by a thread. The Russian army retreated across the Vistula and destroyed all of the bridges on the river, hoping to slow down the inevitable Swedish advance. Left without any proper allies, Peter tried to keep the Polish resistance against the Swedes alive by all means. At first, he tried to bribe and threaten the Polish nobility into not acknowledging Stanisław as king. With Poland devastated by the civil war, the vast majority of the magnates refused to fight the Swedes even if they did not support Stanisław. Having failed to rally the magnates to his side diplomatically, the Russians started brutally raiding the Polish and Lithuanian countryside, and they also besieged the important port of Gdansk. The siege was easily repelled, and military pressure proved to be impractical, as now Peter was just making more enemies. As a final desperate measure to keep the war in the Commonwealth alive, the Tsar sent an envoy to Pope Clement XI. He promised to work on reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches if the Holy See denounced Stanislav as king. Whether his intentions were sincere or not is unknown, though the talks broke down quickly regardless. Without allies, and with the Russian army exhausted by war, Peter went to great lengths to make peace with Charles. He even offered to return all of the conquered lands except for St. Petersburg and the forts along the Neva. The ambitious Charles XII was confident in victory, however, and said to his commanders, "Gentlemen, I have resolved never to make an unjust war, but to end a just one only with the utter ruin of my enemies. I will attack the first to take the field, conquer him, and then deal with the others." Hampered by the constant arrival of foreign diplomats, the slow arrival of reinforcements, and by Augustus himself, the Swedish forces only left Saxony in the autumn of 1707. At the end of the year, Charles crossed the Vistula with his army. Peter, who was celebrating Christmas in Moscow, left for Grodno immediately after hearing of the Swedish advance. He did not stay there for long, as the city was an easy target for the unified Swedish army. Incidentally, Charles entered the city 3 days after Peter left it. During his retreat to Vilnius, Peter ordered his Cossacks and Kalmyks to ravage the countryside and burn everything that the Swedish army could use. This strategy left the Swedish army with a chronic lack of supplies. Facing starvation, they took the last supplies that the peasants had, even further devastating the area. Meanwhile, Peter grew ill in early 1708, leaving all military affairs to his generals. Ill health struck him when he was facing the worst internal disorder of his reign, the Don Cossack revolt led by Bulavin. News of Peter's failing health, as well as the revolt, made the Russian army fall into disorder.
Romania?
Men were deserting at an alarming rate, and morale was low. The generals were also bogged down in Mahilov, as they could not agree on whether the war should be continued with Sweden. Furthermore, 32,000 men also had to be detached from the main army in order to quell Bulavin's revolt. It was anyone's guess which way Charles would go from Grodno, into Livonia or towards St. Petersburg, towards Moscow or into Ukraine. At first, he left Grodno in a northeasterly direction. Petrified at the thought of losing his new capital, Peter ordered St. Petersburg to be additionally fortified. After forcing the city of Vilnius to resupply the army, Charles turned towards the southeast and encamped at Minsk. While there, General Leeuwenhaupt informed Charles that his army in Livonia was ready to march south and support the main army. In the following weeks, some Swedish and Russian forces exchanged fire on the outskirts of the city. This incident made Charles aware of the poor state of the Russian army. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity, Charles decided to attack the Russians at Mahilov and then directly advance towards Moscow.
Like 10 seconds.
Of the poor state of the Russian army. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity, Charles decided to attack the Russians at Mahilov and then directly advance towards Moscow. The Tsar ordered his generals to hold the defensive line around Mahilov at all costs, as Moscow could be easily assaulted from there. Charles decisively defeated the disorganized Russian army at the Battle of Holovchin. However, the majority of the soldiers and generals escaped unharmed to Smolensk. The bridges across the Dnieper were burned during the retreat. The Swedish soldiers were exhausted from the forced marching, food shortages, and bad weather, so they could not build new bridges for a month. After crossing the Dnieper, it became evident that the Russian forces had extensively employed scorched earth tactics. The area between Mahilov and Smolensk was completely devastated, with peasants fleeing with their cattle into the forests and leaving neither crops, tools, nor any other kind of supplies for the Swedes. Additionally, the Russian army burned down almost all buildings, leaving no sturdy shelter from the worsening weather. Seeing a direct advance towards Moscow as suicide,
Russia just it has strategies available to it that would be considered suicide, I think, to many other smaller nations. That it can just use its manpower, yes, but it's just size. It doesn't exactly have very hard to traverse terrain, but when the weather kicks in, and so when worst case scenario, push comes to shove, scorch earth, retreat back further into Russia, burn down everything, and then wait for winter or something to kick in.
The Swedish command reviewed their possible options. As Charles refused to advance into Russia in the aftermath of the Battle of Narva, it came as a surprise to many that he chose to do so now. A variety of factors contributed to his decision. His belief that Ruthenia was a prosperous and resource-rich land, that the Ukrainians wanted to rebel against the Russians, and that he could expect aid from the Cossacks and Crimean Tatars. Meanwhile, a Polish army advanced into Ruthenia as well. The hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, Ivan Mazeppa, was worried at this.
One story about him says that as a young man he was caught in an affair with a noblewoman whose husband punished him by tying him naked to a wild horse and setting it free. Eventually he reached the Cossacks and became their military leader. Oh my god. Oh my god, he must have been a very charismatic person to come in naked on a horse and still capture them. And swindle the wife. Okay.
Influence of several large armies into his lands. He asked Peter for military support. However, the Tsar refused, content to just shadow the Swedish army during its march. Mazeppa saw this as a betrayal of a treaty between the Cossacks and Russia, and promptly allied with the Poles and the Swedes. The Russians retaliated quickly, seizing the Zaporozhian capital.
Mazeppa promised Charles XII a chance to winter in Baturin to help alleviate the Swedish army's lack of supplies and shelter. Not wanting to give the Swedes a base of operation, Peter ordered Menshikov to destroy
Baturin, massacring all of its inhabitants and allegedly tying them to crosses and floating them down the Dnieper. The Russian army also continuously employed scorched earth tactics, depleting the land of anything useful. Trying to avoid further Russian reprisals, the Zaporozhians replaced Mazeppa with a new hetman and continued fighting on the Russian side. The Swedish army, once again low on supplies, was eager for the arrival of the support army. Unfortunately for the Swedes, Lewenhaupt's relief force was ambushed by a Russian army at Lesnaya in late October. Due to the number of casualties and not knowing the state of the Russian force,
There's the music.
Due to the number of casualties and not knowing the state of the Russian force, Lewenhaupt decided to cross the Shozh River as quickly as possible. The army was forced to leave most of its supplies and artillery behind. The small force which did reach Charles was nowhere near as strong as he had hoped. Moreover, the winter of 1708 to 17...
Great Frost of 1709 was the coldest European winter during the past 500 years. It caused sudden winter storms and deep frost, which damaged the Swedish army during the campaign against Peter.
1709 was one of the coldest on record. This, together with the scorched earth tactics, left the Swedish army in a disastrous state. Thousands of soldiers starved to death or succumbed to disease, and many simply froze to death.
The question, isn't that exactly how they defeated the Germans in World War II? Or not exactly, obviously there was help from, they got aid, Lend-Lease, America gave to Britain and Russia. But they basically moved their factories, production, further and further towards the Urals, to further and further in the east, and then just destroying on the way. So let me know if I'm wrong here. It was a combination of scorched earth tactics without the loss of your own industry by having very mobile factory. It sounds ridiculous to say a mobile factory, but a very effective mobile construction force of factories that just kept moving. So it's like, all right, they're getting further in, burn everything, further in, wait for winter, burn everything, further in.
The Russians suffered many casualties during winter as well, though nowhere near as many as the Swedes. At at the approach of spring, Charles was left with less than half of the men that he had started the campaign with. The great Cossack rebellion which he expected did not materialize. Mazeppa promised tens of thousands of soldiers for the upcoming battles against the Russians, yet the number that he could realistically muster was much smaller than that.
Kursk. I just watched a World Graphics World War II video on that.
Russians. Yet the number that he could realistically muster was much smaller than that.
Where's Poltava?
Charles's last hope was Stanisław. The Polish and Swedish forces kept regular lines of communication during their advance into Ruthenia. Since correspondence between the two forces stopped during winter, Charles assumed that the weather simply bogged down his allies' army. The reality of the situation turned out to be far more disheartening. Stanisław's armies retreated into Poland to consolidate power, and due to a miscommunication between himself and his commanders, nobody informed Charles that he was left alone. In the end, it was one of his own envoys to the Ottoman Empire that informed the Swedish king of Stanisław's position. Unable to advance or retreat, Charles saw only one option for his army's survival. He needed to capture a well-provisioned fort and wait until support arrived. On the 1st of May 1709, the Swedish army besieged the port of Poltava, some 300 kilometers east of Kiev.
There it is.
The Swedes could have taken the fort easily by force. However, Charles did not want to risk any unnecessary damage to the defenses or the grain stores. Peter saw this moment as critical. He advanced towards Poltava from northern Ruthenia and ordered most of his senior generals to assemble there with their troops. By June 15th, the entire Russian army had arrived on the east bank of the Voskla River. Peter's primary objective was to cross the river with his army.
That's a big army.
To divert the attention of the Swedes, he sent some cavalry to feign a crossing south of Poltava. Charles then rode out of his camp to see what was happening. What occurred next was one of those minor chance events that sometimes decides the fate of nations. The Swedish king was shot in the foot by a Cossack and refused to have the wound tended to until he nearly fell unconscious. To make matters worse, this took place on June 17th, his birthday, a bad omen which further demoralized the Swedish troops. While Charles was weakened by...
I get you're trying to be strong, and that's very brave of you, Charles, but it would be even more demoralizing than to see you injured. It would be to see you dead.
Fever, his generals could not agree on the response against the Russians.
But I think certain people like Charles II or people like Alexander the Great, or I'm not saying Charles II is on the same level as Alexander the Great, obviously, but just it's hard to say, oh well, you should have not been so tough and gotten help. But I think there's something special about people like this that you get the sometimes they're amazing because of these the pride, and so it's complicated, and I think wrong to say, oh, seek help, when I think that's the essence of why these people like Charles II are so great, and so can't expect them to take every rational decision.
Peter used this opportunity to cross the river and set up camp north of Poltava. The camp was fortified afterwards, and a series of redoubts were built. To the rear, the Russian position was protected by the river and marshland. There was no chance of the Swedes mounting any flanking maneuvers. The Swedish army numbered around 22,000 men, with a similar amount of cavalry and infantry. They also had around 30 guns. However, the artillery was not used during the battle, since Charles anticipated a quick breakthrough. There were also around 3,000 of Mazeppa's Cossacks and 1,000 Poles on the Swedish side. The Russian army had in total around 80,000 men, with over 30,000 infantry, around 20,000 horsemen, and 23 to 25,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks.
I'm not a huge fan of the Russian uniforms, the green. I mean, it's probably the most camouflaged, but I don't think this era of warfare is worrying about camouflage at all. I like the Swedish light blue and yellow.
The Russians also had over 100 guns. The numbers and the positions of the armies remind us of the Battle of Narva. Nevertheless, there are two important differences here.
Battle of Narva was so boring. I'm sorry, it was. It was a Swedish massacre. It just seemed.
The Swedish army wasn't led by its best commander, and the Russian army had been transformed
That's
from
gonna make a lot of people mad. I don't mean boring. Maybe I don't know enough.
Wasn't led by its best commander, and the Russian army had been transformed from a peasant mob into a
What was that?
commander. And the Russian army had been transformed from a peasant mob into a credible fighting machine. The Swedish War Council debated on whether they should use a cautious or aggressive plan of attack. The more senior commanders in the army preferred a steady offensive, while the younger ones proposed an all-out attack.
This is the first time I've seen this. This is really nice.
In the end, the king chose to heed the advice to strike the iron while it's hot. Unable to take part in the battle himself, Charles devised a battle plan and entrusted it to Field Marshal Rienschold. What Charles did not know was that the Field Marshal was on bad terms with most of the other generals. On account of that, he failed to relay the plans properly to them, dealing a significant blow to the organization and cohesion of the army before the battle even started.
Strike the iron while it's hot. That, like a blacksmithing term. I never really thought about what that meant. Strike the iron while it's hot. I obviously it meant like go, but it's a blacksmithing term. Like strike the iron while it's hot, so you can form it. This probably sounds really stupid, but it was epiphany for me for that phrase. Never ignore me.
Blow to the organization and cohesion of the army before the battle even started. Preparations for the battle started on the 9th of July 7th. The Swedes left 2,500 men to guard the baggage train and camp, 2,000 in front of Poltava to prevent a breakout, and another 1,500 to check the Cossacks and Kalmyks. A crucial part of Charles's plan was the element of surprise, so the army started preparing to attack at night. The lack of organization became evident here, as the cavalry took too long to form up and the summer night was quite short. By the time the Swedes were ready to attack, the Russians were already alert. At 4 a.m., General Rus started the Swedish offensive by trying to envelop the first frontal redoubts. The Swedes attacked relentlessly and took the first two, but they were unable to advance further. Russian artillery devastated the assaulting soldiers, and they did not have enough men left to attack the remaining redoubts. The Russian commanders still feared the Swedish troops and asked Peter to send the infantry from his camp to aid the defenders at the redoubts. Peter decided to not make any unnecessary moves, since he knew that the Swedes were suffering heavy casualties and that it would only be a matter of time before they lost steam.
I was gonna say, man, you got a lot of soldiers doing nothing, but that was pretty good reasoning.
While this was happening, Löwenhaupt and Rienschold drove back the main body of the Russian army behind the redoubts. However, they did not coordinate their attacks well enough and were split up. Charles, watching the battle from afar, ordered both Rus and Löwenhaupt to reconnect with the main body of the army outside of the Russian camp.
Wait, does Charles die here? Does Charles die here?
Rus had lost most of his men already and decided to retreat to a redoubt by the river, where he later surrendered. Löwenhaupt, after several hours of inconclusive fighting, led his 2,400 men through intense artillery fire to Rienschold's force. With what was left of the Swedish army united, they began advancing towards the main Russian force. It was at this point that Peter ordered the gates of the camp to be opened and 30,000 of his infantry to array. They began advancing towards the main Russian force. This was left of the Swedish army united. They began advancing towards the main Russian force. It was at this point that Peter ordered the gates of the camp to be opened and 30,000 of his infantry to array in battle lines. The cavalry subsequently formed up at the flanks. The Swedish commanders, seeing that the Russian line was significantly wider than their own, stretched the Karelians thin in an effort to avoid envelopment.
Guys, you're a little outnumbered.
While they were approaching the Russian army, Peter's artillery devastated the Swedish forces. Fearless in the face of death, the elite Swedish infantry approached until they could see the white in their enemies' eyes.
Guys, that's so manly. I'm gonna say it. If I was driving up the hill, I don't want to say it. I want to think I would be a brave soldier. But if I saw a guy just blown to bits next to me, see ya. Maybe I wouldn't with training.
Unleash several musket volleys. What was supposed to be their deadliest weapon came to be almost useless. The winter cold and bad weather in the last year reduced the quality of their gunpowder, and most of the shots did not even reach the Russians. The Russian volleys, in contrast, killed many Swedes. Starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered, the entire Swedish army charged.
Well, why didn't the cold gunpowder affect the Russians?
The few units which made it to the Russian lines fought bravely before being killed. Sources tell that only the company led by Count Torstensson, grandson of the famous Lennart Torstensson.
Guys, I don't know why I'm rooting for the Swedish side and not the Russian side. All right, this isn't 21st century, Ukraine stuff. This is early 1700s. My brain just sort of picks a side. All right, so if you're wondering why I'm kind of rooting for the Blues, I don't know. That you have to ask my brain that.
Tell that only the company led by Count Torstensson, grandson of the famous Lennart Torstensson, managed to penetrate the Russian lines before being enveloped and massacred together with their leader.
Jesus.
As the defeated Swedes retreated from the battlefield, the Russian cavalry pursued them and cut down many. Meanwhile, Charles, after having his bodyguards killed by a cannonball, gathered what was left of his army and retreated south. In the end, the Swedes lost around 7,000 men, with a further 2,700 captured, including Rienschold and other top commanders. The Russians had 1,300 men killed and another 3,300 injured.
Not bad.
Constantly pursued by the Russian army under Menshikov, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire with 1,000 of his men.
Oh, right. This is bringing back something. Something funny is about to happen. Like, doesn't Charles, like, he gets welcomed by the Ottomans, but then, like, demands a bunch of stuff and then, like, refuses to leave or something? And I don't know why I saw Peter as a sort of an inept figure, but he did pretty well this episode.
The rest of his army, in the hands of Löwenhaupt, surrendered to the Russians at Perivolochna 3 days after the battle. The captured commanders were kept as Peter's prisoners, while the soldiers that caused Peter so much trouble were settled in Siberia. For Sweden, the Battle of Poltava was a catastrophic defeat.
I don't know why I thought I would have said pretty certain Poltava. I just thought that was a win for Sweden.
Its elite continental army was annihilated,
Clearly not.
grievously reducing its defensive capabilities. Peter called his great victory at Poltava a divine miracle, as he finally managed to defeat the most formidable army in Europe. Russian armies would now be free to encroach into Poland and the Baltic.
Scorched earth tactics for the win, literally. And look how formidable the lower Dnieper River is as a...
without any resistance. Following nearly a decade of Swedish domination in the Great Northern War, Russia would now gain the upper hand. The war, however, was not over, and our next episode will come soon. So make sure you are subscribed.
I am. I really gotta pee, guys. And, well, I'm done anyway. Awesome episode. I think I'll watch the next one either today or tomorrow. See you guys next time.